Good mythical morning, everyone. It's the one and only the majestic Silverback coming to you live on another edition of the Sirius Report with none other than the man, the myth, the legend himself, London Paul. And we're going to get down to the nitty gritty of everything that's going on. I know the response has been absolutely tremendous. And guys, if you haven't done so already, look, we don't get a penny out of promoting this. I just love promoting great work and great people and great products and services because it's just phenomenal. If you haven't done so, get yourself on the preferred exclusive podcast list with the Sirius Report, where Paul, on a weekly basis, breaks down the entire geopolitical landscape. I mean, having Paul here once a week, hey, that's phenomenal. It's great. But having him and having access to his thoughts, his ideals, as somebody who has a finger to the pulse of what's going on in the world is absolutely vital. He's going to give you the play-by-play from multiple angles in such a way that nobody else can even match. I'll be honest with you. You look at most talking heads in the United States. I don't care if it's the new media, alt media, the dinosaur media, whatever media you want to talk about. They have a very myopic view of things. They have a very U.S.-centric view of things. And oftentimes they're either speaking into an echo chamber or they are forecasting in a bubble. They don't have the facts. They don't have a grand scope of what's going on globally. London Paul is one of those guys who has a grand grasp of what is going on globally, and he's able to break it down in such a way that makes sense. So there's no mental mystification here, folks. You're going to get raw intelligence directly from the Sirius Report and directly from London Paul. With that being said, Paul, thank you again for being on with us. It is always an honor and a pleasure, and I'm humbled to have you on, sir.
Well, likewise, and thank you for that very humbling introduction.
Hey, the old proverb says to give credit where credit's due, Paul. I'm just highlighting the truth of what's already there, my friend. I love your work. There's no question about it.
And thank you, and it's really great that we can do this each week.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's a treat. I look forward to my Monday mid mornings.
Yeah, well, no, and likewise, very much. So I guess we said we'd sort of talk about the inauguration, which seems a good starting point. I mean, I don't usually watch any television, to be fair, but I made a point of watching the speech, and yeah, clearly the overall emphasis was about we want to make America a great nation again, united, and he wants to put America's interests first. That's fine, but he said, but not at the expense, of other nations who should also put their own nation's interests first. So. And that's a very important point, and that was the general theme. But I picked out a few points, and he made some interesting comments, and I'll repeat some of the comments he actually made. He said, today's ceremony, however, has a very special meaning, because today we're not merely transferring power from one administration to another, or from one party to another, but we're transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people. And he talked obviously about the fact of the establishment that protects itself and not the citizens of the country. Their victories are not being, your victories, their triumphs are not your triumphs. I think overall, for me, that was a clear indication that he's saying to the people, now, okay, people don't necessarily know what the establishment means, but I think it was a clear indication. He says the days of the cabal are numbered. And the cabal just have no idea what he's planning. You could see some notable faces there looking very, very anxious, very, very afraid of what's coming, but they really don't know what he's going to do. And that is obviously to their detriment, and obviously to the people of the US, that's hugely important. So I think that was the first thing. Then he made the point that he wanted to reinforce old alliances. Well, there's obviously like the US and the UK is a classic example of that, but form new ones. Well, Russia's a clear example of that, I think, and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. Well, absolutely. I mean, the future problems in this world when we stop waging pointless wars all boils down to terrorism. And okay, we know who's responsible for creating ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., and how it's obviously got out of control, and they still have some influence over them, obviously, but not entirely. Yeah. And that's the global issue we're going to face in a multipolar world. Not because we're no longer going to have this stupid idea that Russia's going to bomb the US, or the US is going to bomb Russia, or anything. That is all just nonsense. That was all, for me, a lot of the Cold War just wasn't reality. It was a way of allowing both sides to spend ridiculous sums of money on arms.
Yeah.
And that's essentially it, because it was profitable for a cabal to do that.
Right.
And then the final point that kind of stood out for me was when he said, "We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the earth from the miseries of disease, and to
Mm.
harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow." Well, that's a hugely powerful statement of intent. And I think we all know, regarding eradicating disease from the planet, he's already made sort of comments in the direction of pharmaceutical companies. And I think allowing, there are suppressed technologies out there to come to the fore, maybe not what people imagine. There's a lot of use of all these Star Trek type technologies. I'm not necessarily buying into those, but certainly we have suppressed technologies which
Right.
they didn't want to come to the fore because the hydrocarbon industries were hugely profitable for them. But it seems clear as well that he kind of sees the US military and the agencies diverting its resources into space exploration instead of fighting pointless wars across the planet in the future. I think that's something we're likely to see, because you can't just say to all the army, well, actually, we're just going to bring you all home and you can just sit there and do nothing.
Right.
Because they're going to say, well, actually, well, what are we going to do? We've got to have some future. So I think it's important that you divert those resources into something productive. Now, people will say, well, space exploration is just a waste of money. But it's this point that if you can change an economy from being on a war footing to a peaceful economy, you have to still provide growth and stimulation. And people say, well, okay, you can take all that money, move it away from bombing Syria or anywhere else in the world, and divert it into the US economy and stimulate it. You can, but that only works for a number of years. And in the end, once you've done that, then there's a problem. Well, what are we going to do now with them? How are we going to, because ironically, it's kind of a strange thing to say, and I'm not advocating war, quite the opposite, but when the US have curtailed or reduced significantly military spending, they've always had economic recessions.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we need to kind of be aware of in the future, that if you're going to divert the US military and agencies into something more productive, they're going to have to do something. So now, what do we mean by space exploration? Well, we'll have to see, because obviously there was a number of aborted plans in the 80s through the 90s where things, they kind of flitted and pretended to do some space exploration, but never really did it. So we know the Chinese are interested, certainly the Russians, and maybe there'll be a united front in that regard across all those nations and other ones in the respect of that. But I guess we'll have to see. And really, at the moment, space exploration isn't really that important in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. You know what was funny is that you mentioned the cabal not having an idea, not of what Trump's going to be doing, because the only thing that's predictable about Trump is that he is unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
The recent Davos, the recent meeting in Davos, you had the elite sitting around, and they were discussing, and one of the topics of discussion that was leaked was the fact that they are absolutely deluded that they can somehow convince Donald Trump of their facts, all the while they're having their caviar and $50 hot dogs. They were
Mm-hmm.
going to somehow convince Donald. So don't worry about the tweets they were saying. One of the individuals there at Davos. I'm sure he will be convinced of the facts that we will present to him. Uh, think again. This is how irrelevant they are. It's I don't know if you see, Paul, the recent bludgeoning that Kellyanne Conway, who is one of the members of Trump's administration, did to a mainstream media news host on Meet the
Mm-hmm.
Press, where she
Oh
said,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, in response to them attacking the press secretary, and she said, you guys, your job is to report the news, not give your opinion. You're an opinion columnist. That's why your approval rating is about 14%. That we need to really think our relationship to the press. These are huge monumental changes, and they are literally running scared. They don't know where to begin, man.
Well, no, absolutely, and of course the thing that also will have kind of terrified some of them out of Davos, and something I covered in the podcast, is there's a big focus now on Russia about
Yeah.
investing in the Russian economy, and obviously the topic was, well, it looks likely Trump's going to want to normalize relations with Russia and then take it on the stage further. And I guess they're absolutely terrified of that. And then of course Jinping comes out with his speech, and we can talk about that in a bit when we talk about China, and the kind of comments he came out with were,
Yeah.
they just don't know where to turn. Because, and the irony of course is, throughout my lifetime every US president's always been backed by the media, and now we're seeing these incredible outbursts by the mainstream media where they're attacking their own president.
Hmm.
But they're attacking you because they're so terrified of you.
Yeah.
And of course, if he really wants to, and if they push him too far, he could just revoke their licenses. And
That would be
I
great.
wouldn't be surprised if he does that. He may make an example of one of the news agencies and say, okay, right, I'm just going to revoke your license, or I'm going to start putting limitation. We're going to do something, and the rest of them will shut up pretty rapidly. But you're absolutely right. There needs to be a realization, and this is the important thing. And I think it's, we talk about what's he going to do economically in the nation, what's he going to, what's his foreign policy. But for me, the interesting part is going to be, how does he handle the media? Because by how he handles the media is largely what's going to change the hundreds of, millions of people. Because let's face it, it's the same in the UK. Only a small percentage of people really know what's going on.
Right.
It's waking up the rest of the people in nations to the reality of what's going on. Now, he can use Twitter, and he's got his own method of delivering his messages. But if he can start to get mainstream media as the average person perceives it on site, that's going to make a huge difference in terms of re-educating the people of the world. Because of course, what comes out of the US in that regard, other nations are going to say, well, hang on a minute, the US mainstream media, or whatever we want to refer to in the future, is now reporting this. Well, why is my media contradicting? So they're all going to have to get in line and start to do likewise, because the UK is as bad. I mean, we have some newspapers that have printed some elements of truth in recent years, but by and large, it was the anti-Trump rhetoric, it's the anti-Russian rhetoric. I mean, it's pretty standard across Western nations. And
Mhm.
maybe Trump can see that as a great example to the rest of the Western world. We're going to get our media to toe the line and start behaving itself. And as you say, reporting facts. And if you have an opinion column, yeah, it's an opinion. But when the rest of the news has to be factually based, of course. When have we had that? I can't remember ever having that in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Well,
Me
since I
neither.
took an interest in the news.
I agree with you. I mean, me as well. I mean, I remember back in the 70s and 80s, we had what 54 media companies here in the United States, and I think it's pretty much almost the same amount in the UK. That's all
Mm-hmm.
been condensed. I mean, in the UK, you guys are down to what, like a handful? Not even like maybe two or three, most.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, because there's all this idea, well, there's all these newspapers, but they're all owned by the same people.
Correct.
And no, absolutely, that's the case. But that's again the illusion of, oh, there's all this choice because I can go and buy 10 or 15 different newspapers every day, or whatever it is.
Right.
It's just an illusion. It's not reality. And of course, that is fundamentally what's going to change. And yeah, he can change and lead by example and change the US economy and start to put measures in place, and people will see tangible differences. But they need to understand as well what's been going on, because if we want to avoid a repeat of this in 50 or 100 years' time, when the cabal tries to come crawling in through the back door, thinking, well, everyone's forgotten what's happened, the world, to a large extent, needs to understand what's really going on. And there's a number of obvious things that will immediately, stimulate and garner a lot of interest in how you deal with it. And I think that's an important part that not only does the US face, the UK and other nations, they need to know the reality. And it's going to be pretty painful for people. But if they don't, the risk is we'll have a honeymoon period for a few decades, and then people will forget what happened, and
Yeah.
history gets buried, and then suddenly they'll come back and go, oh, now we can seize an opportunity. But that's the risk we've got to avoid, and being complacent that, yes, the cabal's going and they're on the way out, but don't give them a sniff of a chance of coming back.
I agree with you. I think if anything that is to be learned and gleaned from this whole entire political season is definitely that the people of the world need to be vigilant, more vigilant now than ever, especially in the Western democracies. We need to hold these people accountable, and we should never ever give them an opportunity to to sneak back in because there's a crevice because somebody wasn't paying attention. I totally agree with you, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've had instances in where they got sloppy in Syria and allowed Daesh back into cities because they took their eye off the ball for a week or two. Well, they just can't do this anymore until the job's done, and it's not going to happen overnight. This is going to take years to achieve on a global scale. They've got to have their wits about them at all times, because the risk is, if they don't, it's going to come back and bite them in the future. But I mean, I'm encouraged. I think, I mean, looking at some of the executive orders, there's some interesting stuff. I mean, we know leaving the TPPs was an obvious thing. Renegotiating NAFTA, I think, is important. I think the 5-year lobbying ban is hugely important. he's leading by example and saying, well, we're going to have budgetary constraints on the government. We're not going to recklessly spend money. He's talking about modifying Obamacare. Well, frankly, that has to happen because Obamacare was an absolute disaster. And so these are important things. He's also, the thing he did with the CIA, I think was hugely relevant. Well, I mean, it was a bit subtle talking about columns, but I think a lot of people pretty much picked up on it quickly. He was talking about fifth columnists now. And that's the other thing I think people need to be aware of is the CIA aren't all cabal. They're not all bad guys, for a better word. Neither is the IMF. They have, it's this hodgepodge and mix of people within these organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with the military. Okay, it seems now that Trump's got a lot of support in the military, which is going to be hugely important going forward. But it didn't mean that every aspect of the military was happy with what Obama was doing. There was a lot of dissension in the ranks, particularly over Iraq and Afghanistan as two examples, which I think why they were very reluctant to have sort of major troop deployment in Syria. I know there's obviously certain elements of agencies in there, but it's very low key, and there wasn't a huge amount of actual troop deployment for that very reason. So, but I think his comments were basically saying to the CIA, we're going to sort you out and we're going to root out the fifth columnist, and we're going to make the CIA the organization it should be and not the organization that it has been for decades.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. How do you think the Eurozone is handling this whole entire thing right now, now that the inauguration is behind us and it's Trump administration day one? And speaking of Trump administration day one, I mean, it was just last night that there was a drone strike and 3 Al-Qaeda leaders just got killed.
Well, I mean, this is the point where it'd be interesting, I mean, to see from a foreign policy perspective how the US now handles itself in Syria, but or Iraq for that matter. But going back to yours, well, I heard, and I had a message, I haven't seen the detail, that apparently, talking about the Eurozone, Trump's told Brussels to stop the idea of the EU army or lose NATO funding. Which is kind of not entirely surprising because his view is, nations aren't contributing. That's the point that, from the European perspective. They're very nervous about, well, what's going to happen? He said, NATO's obsolete. Yes, it is. But once again, does that mean it's the end of NATO? Well, it is as it currently exists. Can it be reformed into an organization it should be, which is more defensive, not offensive? Well, absolutely. But I think Europe's very frightened because if they pull the plug, and I think there was all this talk, the EU army, it's a capitalist, ideology. They're trying to conform it. Why would they bother? They have NATO. They have control. Why do they need to create another army? It's irrelevant. So it wasn't. This was a direct kind of policy decision because they feared the end of NATO, and I think they still fear it. Well, maybe this will make them think, well, okay, we don't need to fear the end of NATO, but we're going to have to renegotiate the position. Now, of course, the whole question is how much influence did Washington have over the EU? Well, I think the sanctions is very much a clear case that they have a huge influence, despite the fact the EU's going, no, we make independent decisions. It's down to us what we do. It's got nothing to do with Washington. But I think when Washington says jump, the EU says how high. So it's interesting how that relationship's going to change it, because I don't think Trump's kind of that interested. He's not going to be interested in giving edicts to the EU. So what's going to happen with sanctions? Because I think at some point in the not too distant future, Trump's going to sit down and go, this is insane, all these Russian sanctions. Why do we bother with them? They're totally counterproductive. And in fact, ironically, the US was breaking all the sanctions while telling the European Union not to break the sanctions. And the European Union were finding all clever manner of ways to avoid the sanctions and carry on. So it was a little bit farcical anyway. But I think that's an important standpoint as to what happens with regards to that, because I think if Trump says, well, we're ending sanctions against Russia, the European Union's not going to go, well, we're carrying on, because they have suffered hugely. And as I wrote in an article on the website to do with how Russia's diversified its economy, the European nations, and I highlighted Austria as an example, who are now very frightened that even when sanctions end, they're not going to get their share of the market back, because they have diversified in such a way that they've pulled a lot of what they were importing into the internal market. And now they've got such a surplus, they're able to export it. But of course, they're not exporting it to EU nations because they're not allowed to. So the whole dynamic shifted to other parts of the world. And the European Union sat there going, well, hang on, where do we fit in the future with terms of trading? I mean, even the likes of Austria did huge amounts of trading, and that's grown exponentially since, 2000. So there is the problem: is how do these nations readapt in the new world? So likewise, they're all going, well, what's Trump going to do? Well, and I think the elections coming up, you've got obviously in France, Holland, Germany, they're obvious examples of, are we going to see a kind of Trump type result in those nations? Well, it's very possible. And I think that's where the whole melting pot is in terms of, and then you've got the whole banking system, which is in utter collapse. And we're seeing Italy actually really in out almost mutiny now. I mean, they're having demonstrations in Italy against NATO. They're saying we want an end to sanctions with Russia. This is insane. And you can see that nations are now, since Trump's been elected, visibly moving away from the previous edict. And you're seeing Merkel more and more isolated. And Germany is a great example of, well, privately, and I've known this for a considerable time, they've been in talks with Russia about forming, joining this sort of what I call the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, and obviously Tehran axis. This has been going on without Merkel present. I think Merkel's aware it's happening, but she's not aware of the discussions. And there's so much dissension amongst the nation now in the ranks of lawmakers. We said this on the previous show, where they've just had enough. So there's this huge melting pot going on in Europe. And I think obviously Trump's election is just adding fuel to the fire, as it were. And quite how the EU nations are going to react to this and what he's going to say and do, well, I think will have a huge bearing, because whatever the European Union says, they're going to be influenced by what Washington says, because they have been, despite all their arguments to the contrary. Hello?
I apologize, Paul. I was talking. I had the mute button on.
Oh, no worries.
I was just about to ask you, how is Russia taking this whole thing, and what are they doing? Before we went live, you talked about Russia, reprioritizing its economy and diversifying things. Could you
okay, let's talk a bit about that. Yeah, they had this realization from an export perspective that they were heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, gas, and oil. And they went, well, if the squeeze is going to be put on us through sanctions, we're going to have to start diversifying the economy. Now, of course, the great perspective from Russia's point of view is that because this, and I'll talk about the import substitution first. Now, what that's had a huge impact in recent years. So, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, 76% of the products on the list of essential medicines are now manufactured in Russia. And this has been a huge success in the engineering sector, where they've slashed the amount of imports. So what they've actually now done is, and it's happened agriculturally as well, so they've reached a point now where they've got such a surplus that they're now saying, well, actually, because we've had the success of the import substitution program, and given now Russia's got this status of a country free of foot and mouth disease, the Russia's agricultural ministry is preparing this program on the state support of an export of agricultural products, and they're working within the framework of the World Trade Organization. So it sees now that it can successfully use this import substitution program into export, and it's given this diversification from the hydrocarbon industry. So, well, the idea was, Russia's economy is going to collapse, and to be honest, most people thought it would when the oil price collapsed. Well, it's interesting how the ruble moved perfectly in unison, so it didn't affect them at all, because obviously they were selling the oil in dollars. So that was quite clever that no one seemed to pick up on. And of course, the Russian economy was seriously in recession, but it now seems to be coming out of it, it's stabilizing. And of course, this import substitution and export substitution kind of policy is what's starting to reap benefits for them. But of course, it's been hugely beneficial to a lot of nations who previously weren't doing a significant amount of trade with Russia. But of course, again, this leaves the European Union and other nations out in the cold, and they're very much now afraid of what the future is. Now, is Putin going to turn over a new leaf and go, oh, let's put it all behind us? Well, he might well do. But equally, he may say, well, I'm not going to put the other, our other new agreements in jeopardy just to save you as nations, because of you have to learn the consequences. So I guess we'll see what happens. But certainly this reasoning, and of course, this is what it is. Russia knew the sanctions were coming. They knew that Ukraine was going to happen. So they started to make plans and said, okay, we have to diversify or we're going to sink, or we'd risk sinking. And of course, whilst it didn't affect them so much in terms of the gas pipelines, because they can sell contract, it does start to impact on them, not in the medium long term, not the short term. Whereas they don't set the oil price, so the problem they had is, well, if the oil price collapses, then the risk was that, and I think the oil price was collapsed to try and, or take down the Russian economy, as well as trying to get them involved in a war in Ukraine. And of course, it failed on both counts and was a really damaging blow to the cabal in the process. But I mean, I'm not saying Russia's got the perfect economy; it's got problems still, and it realizes that, and it knows it's a month on month, year on year reappraisal of where they're going, but they are making strides in the right direction, rather unlike the West that keeps pretending nothing's happening and keeps going down blind alleys, which ultimately leads to nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. Very also, it's also pretty funny when you look at, I often said this, that the American dream is built on Saudi pipelines, especially with the whole petrodollar and the benefits we received as, having the petrodollar standard. Look at the fact that Saudi Arabia is running out of oil, and they are, massively trying to diversify their economy out of that. Hence the reason why, King Salman has chosen MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, to actually be the successor, and that's where we get into the quagmire of Yemen and whatnot. The Saudis are doomed. I think they're
Oh
running into
yes,
the same.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think they're running into the same problem that the West is running into. They're trying to diversify their economy. They're trying to become like a Dubai, but they
Mm-hmm.
lack the infrastructure. They just lack the complete environment to do that, man. I mean, so they're doomed. They're really going the way of the West, and again, the whole entire petrodollar scheme being totally scrapped is becoming more and more of a reality every day, Paul. Huh?
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at them, they were negotiating with Russia over the whole OPEC deal. I mean, and it's interesting, they've just cancelled a contract for some work they were doing in Ukraine,
Yeah,
the Saudis. Well, that's clearly to appease the Russians in some way. So they think because Russia's the dominant force now in the Middle East, that somehow if they curry favor with the Russians and keep on side with them, that Russia will save them. Well, no, Russia isn't going to save them. You're absolutely right that they lack the guile to be able to do anything, diversify their economy. And
yeah,
yeah, the petrodollar is dying, as we know. And of course, their oil reserves, I mean, they're pumping so much water now. It's unbelievable. But yeah, I mean, they're still a major oil producer. Let's not ignore that fact. But I mean, they've got the price of oil meant they've got huge budget deficits. So,
yeah,
I mean, the mere thought they might have to introduce taxation into their country, imagine what that'll do to the average person. So yeah, Saudi Arabia is very much in a downward spiral, and I think, as is a lot. I mean, I think the issue then comes in what's going to happen to the likes of Qatar. And yeah, you make the point about Yemen, and this is going to be an interesting point with regard to Trump. Well, what's the policy? Because he knows full well that it's an absolutely ridiculous war. I think it's just Saudi's way of trying to impress upon its people. We're still dominant force in the Middle East.
yeah.
We don't care. What reason do they have? I mean, to want to conquer or
Yemen.
Yemen?
That
It's just there's no real reason for it. It's just an act of saying we want to be dominant and show that we're an aggressive force in the Middle East, so the people at home think we still have value as the House of Saud. Well, they don't, and I think Trump will very quickly go, well, this is ridiculous. We're not supporting the Saudis, and leave them to it. And very quickly, Saudi will back out of it, because the one thing, of course, in terms of Yemen, you've got the Iranian support there. And I think they will. I think that's probably another aspect of the Middle East we'll start to see pretty quickly. But how much focus does Trump put on, foreign policy at this stage as opposed to domestic policy? I mean, if I was looking at it, say, yeah, well, there is these massive problems in the Middle East, but if we just stop doing the things we have been, let Russia carry on, we'll support them where we can. But for me, the big focus is what's he going to do at home very quickly to try and start to turn things around, given he knows that you know the whole sort of reset's coming along, that the economic implosion is very likely, and how's he going to offset US's huge trade deficit, etc., etc. So I'm not saying they're not going to look at foreign policy. Of course, they very much will, and his talk about eradicating Islamic terrorism around the world is indicative of that. But I think the focus will be largely on what they do domestically and how they make. And of course, that has its own set of problems, because everyone thinks he's going to be very protectionist about the US and he's going to end it with a trade war with China. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. But as I said to you just before we came on air, I think if Trump has an Achilles heel, I'm not saying he's going to make mistakes and he'll hold his hand up, but he'll do things with the best of his ability, and he'll be right more than he's wrong. I think his foreign policy and how he handles China. I mean, he knows full well a trade war's insanity, but how is he going to handle China going forward? That for me is an interesting, and that's where he may make mistakes. I mean, I'm not saying he will, but I think it's something I would be slightly concerned. I think he seems very keen to cozy up to Russia and wants to, normalize relations, as we just said. But I'm not sure how he's going to handle China. And I know there's a lot of words and a lot of rhetoric, and it's all probably largely hot air. But I think we'll know pretty quickly how he intends to handle China. But he needs to have them on side. And as Xi Jinping said in Davos, and we can talk a bit about that in a minute, that kind of comments he came out with, he needs to line up with that kind of viewpoint. Otherwise, making an enemy of China would be very bad news for the US, which, let's be honest, is going to be economically weak for a considerable period of time.
Yeah, well, absolutely, 1,000%. We have a completely gutted industry. Our banks are a joke. I love arguing with American pundits who say, "Well, the China can't lead. Their market is not as deep or as liquid as ours." And I'm like, what rock were you hiding under? This is not the sweatshop China of the 80s and 90s where they're making Nike sneakers for 10 cents an hour. This is a China that's pulled 650 million people out of poverty and into the middle class. This is the China where three out of the four biggest banks on the planet are Chinese. This is the China where manufacturing is no longer the biggest area or sector of their economy. It's banking, it's finance. This is the China that's involved with the One Silk, One Road, One Belt initiative. And you tell this to most Westerners, and especially Americans, it goes over their head. They just don't understand it. And I can't blame them because most of them can't find Syria on a map. But but the whole thing is people need to understand this is not China's it needs to be handled correctly. And I think if Trump is willing to allow, and I think he might be, I think he is probably, if he's willing to be involved in the development of the Silk Road, I think everybody stands to benefit.
Well, exactly, and that's the whole point. And I think if we can, maybe it's a good point at this juncture to talk a bit about what Xi Jinping said at Davos. And before we came on, we talked about globalization. And for me, globalization's never happened. It was just the cabal, which was centralizing power globally. That's the big distinction for me. And he talked, obviously, Xi Jinping said that economic globalization is not the cause of, refugee crises along the world. It's war, conflict, and turbulence that's created this problem. And he's absolutely right. And of course, we know who's largely responsible for that, the cabal. Absolutely. We talk about the international financial crisis. It's not an outcome of economic globalization. It's a consequence of people chasing money at all costs and absolutely reckless financial regulation. So just blaming the economic globalization for world's problems is just not reality. But of course, we've all been conditions go, globalization's a big problem. Well, if it's ran properly, that's exactly what the One Belt, One Road is. Mm-hmm. It's economic globalization, but it's growing from a perspective of we work together in unison. We harness all our talents and abilities globally, so we can make advancements in science, technology. We can advance civilization, and of course, there are faults. Absolutely, even in what I'm not saying it's a perfect economic globalization model, because as we know, when the global economy is in a downward spiral, it affects everyone. So those people who say there are pitfalls are absolutely correct. And we need to look at that and say, okay, well, what are we going to do? That is a big problem. And I think he made some points where he said things like, the history of mankind tells us that problems are not to be feared. It's refusing to face up to problems and not knowing what to do about them. And I think if the world takes a sensible viewpoint and looks at the challenges of what economic globalization is and embraces the One Belt, One Road for what it really is, then it will meet everyone's needs. We can address the challenges and move globalization as it should be. I mean, it's a bit like talking about democracy. I've always said, I don't think people talk about democracy, but for me, we don't have democracy in the West. We just believe we do.
Right.
And it's like the idea, well, China's a one-party state. Well, yes, it is. But in some ways, if you or I had the ability, it'd take us 20 years to get there, but we can become, presidents. We can become in the very hierarchy of Chinese governance because we show we have the ability, and we proved it for decades of being exceptional in what we do. And as you say, they've taken all these people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into middle class status. That doesn't strike me as a nation that's undemocratic. It's just our perspective that democracy means about having 2 or 3 political parties, and we all get to vote for them. And if we don't like them, we get rid of them.
Right.
But we always have the same government. That's not democracy.
Yeah.
So, and he also made points where he talked about the cause of economic slowdown, and they're all very obvious things. A lack of driving forces for global growth, and inadequate global economic governance. Well, that's true. And uneven global development. Well, that's absolutely true. There's parts of the world that are so poor, and that's absolutely ridiculous. And the Chinese economy is leading by example, so they want dynamic, innovation-driven growth models, a well-coordinated and kind of interconnected approach so it's a win-win cooperation between nations, and develop a model of fair and equitable governance in keeping with how it should be and how the world should always have been. So he was essentially saying, look, we have a choice. It's going to be difficult. We have to turn our back. I mean, he didn't say the cabal directly, but that's what he's referring to. We have to turn our back on this insanity. We can all work together. And, I've heard for years people telling me China's trying to take over. It wants to rule the world. Why would China want to rule the world? I mean, it's learned from history that all empires collapse in the end who try to do it. Why would it stretch itself beyond its own borders when it has 1.3 billion people?
Right.
And it will be absolutely insane. But yes, it will seek opportunities. And if it can dump its dollars and buy industry, and it's bought up huge swathes of Detroit, Michigan, and it's bought the ports in the US because it sees it as an opportunity to develop. Now, of course, what's going to be interesting is where the balancing act comes in, because Trump probably is aware of it, or if he isn't, he'll be aware of it pretty quickly, just how much Chinese influence there is in the US. So you're going to have to work with them. Yeah. And China's quite happy to do that. Right. They will work with other nations. They're not, but it's a win-win situation. And if it benefits the US economically to have Chinese influence there, then there's nothing to be afraid of. They're not. It's rather like the old days of talking about the Cold War, as I said earlier. For me, the Cold War it just never felt like it was reality. This idea that each of these nations were going to incinerate each other into oblivion just made no sense. And
right.
There's been a lot of talk about World War III happening. From my perspective, it's just not a reality, because
no, it's not.
when it comes to the point of annihilating the planet, who's going to actually do it? Well, yeah, there's a few insane people in the cabal we can think of who quite happily would like to see that happen. But the reality is, people within the military and at sufficiently high ranks are just going to say, no, we're not doing this. And I think that's why they pulled back in certain things to do with Syria. They avoided direct confrontation with Russia in that sense. And yeah, there were some incidents that happened where there was a bit of provocation, but rather like the business with Turkey and the ambassador, or the Russian ambassador being killed, they both realized this is an attempt to destabilize our relationship, and we're not going to fall for it anymore. Those days of them pulling these kind of stunts just don't work anymore. And I think that's a big sea change as well in terms of the perception of nations. But the West has got to start coming into line in that regard and not seeing these nations as enemies. Right. But also be mindful, we have to work, it has to work in, mutually beneficial gain. It can't just be all one side. And that's equally applies, if China started being, having a controlling influence in nations that's unacceptable, that's equally not to be tolerated. So this isn't, it's not a one-way street telling the West to behave itself. And of course, that's one thing that Russia and China have done. They've gone to modify the country, particularly China, in terms of kicking out the corruption and all the Western influence. And Russia's done the same because they realize they have huge problems at home and they're addressing them. They don't pretend to be perfect. And whereas the West has this idea that whatever we says goes, and the world has to agree, or to face the consequences. That's
what Pepe Escobar calls the exceptional stand mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. But I also think I've read recently, which is kind of interesting, where there's a lot of talk where people go, "Oh, well, Trump's going to come in and try and break up Russia and China's union, and he's
That
going
is
to try."
stupid.
I mean, why? It's just absolute insanity. Why would he even consider it? And yes, I mean, he's made comments about Iran. Well, let's see what he actually does. I cannot see for the life of me why he's going to start, scratching old wounds to do with Iran again in the future, because
Yeah.
he's only just going to pit himself against Russia and China. He knows there's an alliance, and you can start to see Turkey involved in that. I'm not sure Russia and China exactly trust Erdogan, and with good reason, but he is starting to behave in a far more appropriate manner globally. I'm not sure what he's doing in terms of his own nation, with because he feels that everyone's out to get him. And okay, after a coup, that's understandable to some degree, but we're seeing a big change in the Middle East geopolitically,
Yeah.
and I think that's something from Trump's perspective that he is aware of, and I can't see him equally wanting to make those kind of moves where he's going to alienate nations that will serve a purpose and be beneficial to the US in the future.
Yeah, exactly. You know what always amazed me, Paul, is how we've got it so wrong. How the cabal, how the U.S. politicians, instead of, backing the Persians, which, you go to Iran, women can walk around without a hijab. They can go to university. They can get a high-paying job. They can have their own business. Instead of backing them, we back the wretched Saudis. And then every step of the way, the Iranians like, hey, we're sitting on oil. Can you refine it for us? No. Okay, fine. We need nuclear power in order to refine our oil because we just don't have the infrastructure to get or to increase our refinery capacity. Could you help us? No. Okay, fine. We'll give you the oil. You guys refine it for us and sell it back to us when we'll pay you. No. Then what are we supposed to do? Eat your oil and die. That was the attitude of the entire West. So this whole Iran nuke deal, which most Westerners think, oh, Iran is after nuclear weapons to blow up the Middle East. They have no desire to do that. They have no desire to do that. And for Trump to upset the apple cart right now, especially with what's going on with the Iranian, Chinese, Russian, and even Indian nexus that is forming over there, especially even with the Turks, it is fallacy and stupidity. I think it'll be a mistake, and I don't see him doing it. Like I know the rhetoric of what he said about Iran. I think there's going to be some sort of a workaround has to be done.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just reminded me of a story where I think during the Bush administration, they gave a load of tactical nuclear weapons, dumped them in the Iranian border, and said to Iran, use them against Iraq. And they went, "You must be insane. Why would we do that?"
Yeah,
But that shows the crass hypocrisy where it's all, Iran's this, they're trying to develop nuclear weapons. Hang on, we'll just give them some and hope that they use them because we want to create, a massive conflict in the Middle East because it furthers our aim to redraw the map of the Middle East, which was always the cabal's plan. But
right.
no, absolutely, I can't see why he would do this, and it sort of surprised me that the Obama administration kind of said, well, okay, we'll have the nuclear deal, and then kept imposing sanctions. Well, I know someone personally who, as soon as the sanctions were dropped, immediately did some work with the Iranians and was able to sign some lucrative contracts. And the point is, yeah, the thing that people underestimate, Iran's a very, very educated nation.
Yep.
Highly educated, and educated properly, not like we think being highly educated means in the West. So, and it has a lot of industry. Yeah, I mean, it is very oil based, but there's a lot of interest from Iran now to get people in the West to go and invest in terms of their expertise as well as their finance to drive their economy forward and make it a stronger nation. But yeah, but of course, most people's perspective of Iran is they have no idea what it is because we're back to the lying fake news of the mainstream media.
Yeah, exactly correct. Exactly correct. He's talking about education in the West. I mean, what is education in the West these days? It's really being astute in pop culture. That's that's basically what education in the West is in these days. And safe spaces, which I think in this year, Paul, I think the message to all the snowflakes and those that are wanting the safe spaces is we own the safe spaces now. Your safe spaces no longer exist. Hence the 500,000 women march.
Hello?
Yeah, sorry about that, man. I think you cut out and come back in, but you're good.
Yes, sorry
Um,
about that.
No worries, man. I mean, what else do you see happening? What else is on your radar screen?
Well, I think it's worth you mentioned about talking about India, and I think it's something quite interesting. We had back in November the whole demonetization of the 500 rupee and the 1,000 rupee banknotes, and the government obviously claimed it would curtail shadow economy and crack down on illicit and counterfeit cash and funding illegal activity and even terrorism. But I think we have to be clear, because everyone went, this is about a cashless society. Well, no, it wasn't, because they may have outlawed the existing 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, but they did quite clearly say we're going to replace it with the new 1,000 and 2,000 rupee notes. So
Hmm.
it wasn't about cashless society. The, but the sudden nature of the announcement and the prolonged cash shortages in the weeks that followed have created this huge disruption to the economy. I mean, to put it politely, it was poorly managed. I think we could use far stronger language. And the replacement notes process is very slow and cumbersome. But what it's worth noting, and we're always very critical of central banks, but by all accounts, Modi informed the Reserve Bank of India about this policy, who expressed obviously concerns they couldn't roll out the new banknotes quick enough. Well, how true that was, because after all, they're looking at replacing about 85% of money in circulation. You imagine trying to do that in the UK or the US, and just overnight, taking certain notes out of circulation. So yeah, they had major problems. They had huge cash shortages. Obviously, people were queuing at banks and ATMs. They had transportation issues where they could, truck drivers couldn't drive because of scarcity of cash. And they had, I mean, just even simple things like the tolls on major highways. They had huge queues because the, operators wouldn't take old banknotes.
Yeah.
Their agriculture industry is heavily dependent on cash. So that was hugely impacted. And this is the irony, just at the point when they were severely impacted is the time when they have a major plantation season in mid-November. I mean,
Hmm.
talk about a
Hmm.
spectacular failure of policy. And of course, it deeply impacted the banks and businesses, and their industrial output collapsed from the PMI went from something like 55 in October to about 47 in November. Well, that's a huge fall. And of course, evasion was a big problem. We saw massive people trying to buy gold purchases, and that saw a huge spike in the premium paid. And so it has been an economic disaster what he's done. But it wasn't for me some big capitalist act to have a cashless society. He genuinely thought, absolutely crassly, that he could tackle these economic problems in terms of the so-called black economy and all this kind of financial irregularity and illicit activity going on. He thought he could stop this happening quite easily, and without giving any regard to the problems, given the size of India, which has a population of about 1 billion people.
Hmm.
It was a spectacular fight, but it wasn't some grandiose scheme by the cabal to take control. Because I've always said, if the cabal want a cashless society, well, tell me how their drugs industry works globally, because that is all about. It's not you don't go and buy drugs off a dealer and say, "Excuse me, here's my credit card." It's all based on paying in cash. Well, if they have a move towards a cashless society, and people say, well, what's that got to do with the cabal? Well, we all know the cabal controls all the drugs industry, virtually globally.
Hmm.
Hence why they went into Afghanistan. And there's an interesting backstory that when the US economy was floundering, what did they go and do? Oh, miraculous. They were able to go into Afghanistan. And why did they do that? Because it has a huge opium trade. And what happened to the US economy post 2002? It suddenly had this big upsurge. Well, was that anything to do with the drugs industry coming out of Afghanistan? Well, absolutely.
I think
So
so. Just to
this is a
time that,
precedent.
just to time that real quick, Paul. One thing that I do know for an absolute fact is when you look at the 2008, right before the 2008 market collapse, something interesting was happening around July, August of 2007, as we're entering into the 2008 market collapse that occurred. I'm sorry, July, August of 2008, right before we entered into the 2000 September, 2008 collapse of the markets. What was interesting was this: there was a great deal, and we've known this from HSBC, we've known this from Wachovia, Wells Fargo. There was a great deal of narcotics money that was in these banks. That for some strange reason, because of cracking down because of regulations or whatnot, the narcos, the cartels were going to pull the funds. And there is a great deal of talk. There's a lot of top investigators that have looked into it. Those narcotics money that were parked in those banks were tied into some derivatives, which was also one of the reasons why there was an effect in the U.S. market coming down in 2008, alongside it was just subprime. It was a bunch of people who weren't credit worthy. That was the reason the whole economy went down in 2008. No, there was something more nefarious. And you and I both know narcotics trafficking is big, big, big business for the cabal. So what you're saying is absolutely spot on, man. I mean, is it like a coincidence that all of a sudden, the opium trade, which was non-existent in Afghanistan, was done in secret because the Taliban cracked down on it. Now it's exploded to 97% instantaneously. Great point, Paul.
Oh, absolutely. And we've seen pictures of US forces protecting poppy fields. I mean,
yeah, and they're like, why are we doing this?
yeah, absolutely. So no, I mean, and this is something that's been a huge squeeze in terms of cracking down. I mean, the cabal's obviously had a lot of cash cows over the year, the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and obviously the drugs industry. And I think we're starting to see a squeeze on the oil industry. I think we're going to see a squeeze on the pharmaceutical industry. Certainly, sort of now Trump's obviously been elected. I think you're starting to see a squeeze on the drugs industry, and these are all being major slush funds for the cabal to finance their operations globally. And that's certainly something that I think we'll start to see a big crackdowns. If we're really going to change the world, they're the kind of things that are going to have to happen. But I mean, it's this idea people always go, well, the cabal can just keep printing money. Well, yeah, but the problem we've got now is, they can print money, but every time they keep printing money, all it's doing is damaging the real economy more and more. I mean, it would come to the point where, they can do this notionally from a shadow banking perspective or inside, Wall Street, or everything looks fine, but the real economy is cratering rapidly, and of course, they can't stop that. And therefore, the idea, well, they'll just keep doing things. It will grind to a halt, and we've reached the point there. And of course, no one wants to buy US debt anymore. So we're now seeing a situation for me where you're going to keep seeing more and more the desperation inside the Feds, where they're going to have to keep buying treasuries, and they're going to buy more and more short-term treasuries, and which is a sure sign, of course, that the Chinese are dumping them furiously.
Yeah.
And they reach a point where they just can't carry on. The idea that the cabal can just keep doing what they're doing is proven to be insanity, and they can't do that. And I think someone sent me an email going, well, in terms of the reset, and that's one of the aspects that people always say, well, they can just keep printing things, but there's real initiatives going on which is severely damaging their capability to operate the way they have done for decades and beyond.
Absolutely. Which brings us, I guess, do you want to cover anything on cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, well, I've talked, I mean, to be honest, and Bitcoin's a saying in the UK about Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. Mm-hmm. And, I'm not a big fan for these reasons. I have problems with it primarily because it just looks like fiat speculation. And if we look at what happened in China, where they cornered a huge amount of the market, what did they recently do? There was a huge sell-off of Bitcoin, and what did they do? They moved into gold ETFs. Well, that suggests to me the kind of mindset of they just saw it as a way, let's drive the price and make a huge amount of money. Now we'll move into the gold market because we think that's the next great play. And we all know, we share the viewpoint that gold's going to move, considerably further north in 2017 and beyond that. I also have problems from a security perspective. I have concerns as to who you're buying from and how, someone could have their wallet one day and the next day they don't have it. I don't see a great market for Bitcoin at the moment. What I do see as a fantastic aspect of it is the blockchain technology. That will have, I think, will gather momentum, be used globally in many different ways. I mean, I was looking at something with someone to do with blockchain technology. I wasn't hugely aware of what it was, and when I became aware of it and had a discussion with them, it kind of opened your eyes that in the financial system it will have relevance. It's great because you can store huge amounts of records, but you can't just hack it very easily.
Yeah.
In terms of the actual the technology, the blockchain technology, and you require simultaneous ability to be able to make those changes. You can't just log in and make changes and or try to hack it. So I think it has huge amounts of credibility in respect of blockchain, but I think I have huge problems with it. I mean, where's the market? Physical gold and silver, there's an obvious market for it. There always has been.
Yeah.
But Bitcoin, what do you do with it? I mean, what if you buy it? Work can you work? I mean, yes, there's certain places you can spend Bitcoin and use it, but I mean, and also what concerns me is the cabal. Clearly, I mean, I think it was Blythe Masters who was talking about from JP Morgan expressed an interest a few years ago about Bitcoin. That immediately set alarm bells off, because when those banks start to show interest, I have a problem with it. And
Yeah.
I
What
think,
they're Go ahead.
sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think that's the problem I have, is that
No.
I don't see where its applicability is now. Does that mean in the future cryptocurrencies may have some relevance in the new sort of paradigm? Well, yes, very much so. I think that is a possibility. But as things stand, if you tell me gold, silver, and Bitcoin, well, gold and silver are the obvious ones. Bitcoin doesn't really figure in my vocabulary or something I'd consider. But does that make it that I'm right? And well, maybe I'm not. I could be completely off base with this, but it's not something I'm interested in, because I just don't see, if you want to use it as fiat speculation and it goes up 50% and you sell out and make a huge amount of money and then reinvest your money, well, fine, then you've done well from an investment perspective. But I don't see where it's going to protect you in the coming months, if we do have some big economic crisis globally, or 2008 revisited on steroids, as I put it. So that slightly bothers me. But I mean, I'm always willing to rethink my position on things, and if people can give me convincing arguments. But thus far, I've not heard anything that really convinces me that at this time it has a huge amount of relevance. But of course, the world's rapidly changing, and maybe in the future,
Right.
it will
Right.
very much figure. But I don't think it will exist as it does now, because the other thing, of course, is it's not regulated. Now, that may be, people say that's not, but at some point it's going to have to be regulated. Now, the problem with that is, as soon as you regulate it, the average person is going to, I'm not interested in this anymore. And they're going to walk away from it. Now, when it's regulated and how it's utilized in the future could be very interesting. And therefore, maybe we could talk about this in 2 or 3 or 5 years' time and go, wow, it's really exploded because these changes were made. But I think when the Chinese got involved, they just saw it as a huge opportunity to drive the price up, make a huge amount of money, get out, and then, but to move into gold ETFs kind of suggested the kind of mindset. I mean, if they bought physical gold, fair enough, but gold ETFs are not the ideal. I mean, obviously, I don't know how they've exactly invested in terms of gold ETFs, but we know a lot of it's just very paper based. And if you try to say, I want delivery of my gold, then you've got a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And last but not least, all the mainstream pundits are saying that gold is getting ready to explode. What say you, London Paul?
Oh, good question. I mean, I hear a lot of this idea there's going to be all this kind of, the price is going to collapse and it's going to go to, I can't see it, because I did a study for someone a few years back where we looked at the price of gold, and I said at the time probably 1100 was the bottom, because when it starts to drop below that, you seriously curtail gold production globally.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
I mean, there is an argument that there's a lot of wastage in terms, and I've looked into that, where there is wastage in terms of gold production and how they can, make the costs a lot less in terms of the operational costs, and also the capex costs for that matter. But is there like to be a pull? I don't think so. I think, but of course, the problem is this is not driven by supply demand. It's just driven by the COMEX who just manipulate the price. And when they think, well, we've had enough of this, we'll just dump, I don't know, 100 tons of contracts into the market and just smash the price. Although they have tried that, and of course their ability to smash the price is not as great as it was. And of course we're now seeing the arbitrage, although it's dropped again, it got up to about $40-50 between the West and East, in terms of, because obviously Shanghai's got the physical market. Now, the argument could be is if that starts to widen again, you're going to see people saying, well, here's a great arbitrage opportunity. So I can buy a load of gold in the West and sell it to the East. Well, the Chinese can go, thank you very much. That suits us. No, down to the ground, because clearly it would do. So there's that to factor in. But is there going to be a correction? Well, it might do. I don't know. But you know, long term, yes, there's going to be an increase in the price because gold, I mean, silver even is even more manipulated than gold. I mean, is $1,200 currently roughly a reflective price? No, I think from my perspective, it should be considerably higher. And the ratio between gold and silver is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, silver at what, $16, $17 an ounce is absurd. And I can see more, upside in relative terms in silver than gold, but you know, I see equally they're both very wise investments. But they're not only an investment; it's a protection against what could happen globally. I mean, a loaf of bread is a loaf of bread, and if you go back and chart it historically, if you could buy a loaf of bread 1,500, 2,000 years ago, it works out roughly the same price as what you pay now. Well, that shows that it preserves wealth. And what have we seen to the dollar since the birth of the Federal Reserve? It's worth about 2% and
Yeah.
declining of its value. Well,
Right.
there you go. So that's why it's an obvious investment. But I mean, I've had people who bought it and then said to me, "Oh, well, the price hasn't gone up." But it's not that kind. For me, it's not that kind of investment.
Correct.
But you can. I mean, sure, there's people who bought, and sold, at 18, $1,900 when it rose in 2011. So yeah, there's every possibility. Some people have made a financial killing out of you of buying it that way. And yeah, if people do, then fine. But for me, it's more an investment, and therefore I'm not too worried about whether it drops to 1,000 or drops to 900, or like I said, I don't think it'll ever get that low. But if it drops back, it's not. I don't really care too much about it. It's an investment, but yes, I can see it considerably north. And if we have gold-backed currencies and a gold standard, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's coming, then that just adds more credence and value to owning gold, but also silver very much so. I don't. I mean, it's always seen as the poor cousin, but I think it very much has a relevance in the future also.
Yeah. Awesome. Paul, we're at the end of the broadcast, man. Why don't you give out how people can get follow you, your social media, as well as how they can subscribe to your work?
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, obviously we have the website, and I'll spell out the Sirius report. That's SIRIUS. That's .com. That's obviously a website. It's all free material. I've started to write a few articles again. I think there's about 100 articles on there in economics, geopolitics, and other subjects. We do a little news update each day to give some people snippets of news that's coming out. There is obviously the premium content page that's on the front page, and there we, as you point out and very kindly said at the start of the show, where we do an in-depth analysis of daily events and things that come to pass, and that's in the geopolitical and financial field. And we do 5 of those a week. They're roughly 10 to 15 minutes, each podcast, and that's $4.75 or equivalent per month. We have the Twitter page, which we'll start to put a few more things on. That's obviously at the Sirius Report. And essentially, we have the Facebook page where it's, obviously the Sirius Report. If you just put that into Facebook, we do have a premium page for our podcast subscribers where we put some additional articles, and we encourage people to try and discuss things and talk about things amongst the group to try and sort of stimulate some interest, or people have questions. And of course, you can always email us. Obviously, the SiriusReport@gmail.com, and we'll respond to you pretty promptly. Either I will or Lisa will, who works very hard with me on the Sirius Report, does a lot of work in the background, which some people are aware of and other people aren't. She puts a lot of effort in, and the website was her creation, which looks, for me, is great. It's very clean looking, and it's very informative and helps people understand things. But if people have got ideas, please let us know, because we always want to improve what we're doing. And obviously, coming on the Road Money Show is fantastic exposure for us, and we're very grateful, and we're very appreciative of your very kind words you've said, because we just want to help spread the word in terms of what we believe we understand is going on. And if we all work together as groups, it will make things a lot easier. Where it's a bit like a multipolar world in the alternative media. We need to stick together and work together, and demonstrate to people what is the reality of what's going on, because there's going to be a big need for this in the future.
Absolutely, 1,000%, Paul. I totally agree with you. And the other thing is this: I mean, where can you go? I mean, where can the average person go for a complete understanding of the entire geopolitical world, except places like the Sirius Report a handful of other sites, as well as Rogue Money. That's it. Everybody else it's either Eurocentric or Western, or I'm sorry, U.S. centric or Western centric viewpoints. They're all, screaming in echo chambers. They're all forecasting in a bubble. They're all making such asinine statements because they don't understand of what the bigger, broader picture is. They don't understand what China is. They don't understand what Russia really is. They have no clue, and they somehow still think that statements like, "Oh, there's going to be World War III. It's going to happen." No, how? you know, so it's we are the real contrarians in this whole entire thing, Paul. We really are.
Oh, absolutely, and we have to just keep doing that because at some point, well, increasingly people across the Western world are understanding and getting a kind of, in some cases, a really sharp reality check as to what's going on, and this is all about, it's part of the education. I mean, a big thing that Trump knows that, and it's the same not just in the US but across the Western world in particular. We need to have a complete re-education process, not just in
Yes.
terms of going to school and what that involves, but all of us. There are going to be things that we'll find out in the future. Even from our perspective of looking at things for many years as to what's going on, where we're going to go, wow, we didn't know that, and that's going to be a very kind of difficult time for a lot of people. So the more light we can shine on the reality of things and help people kind of transition to the new paradigm in that regard, then that's really for me. I mean, yeah, I could talk for 100 years about all manner of subjects, but the reality is, if no one's listening and it's not really having any impact, there's no point doing it. But I think,
Correct.
particularly in recent years, all of us who are involved in this are starting to see that we are making some progress in that regard, and that is really what this is about. It's raising awareness because at some point, you know, the realization is going to hit home, and then people will then have the likes of us to look back and go, okay, well, I heard these guys have talked about this. Let me go and see what they've been talking about. And you've got a huge, I mean, you think about all the shows you've done, there's enormous amounts of information there that people can relate to. So
Yeah.
these are important things, and this is what really, this is about. And yeah, it can be frustrating, and it has been at times, but I think we're finally starting to see some light at the end of that very dark tunnel that's been around for more years than any of us care to remember.
Absolutely. I believe when it's all said and done, and when people climb the mountain of the broader geopolitical perspective, they will find the Sirius report as well as Rogue Money. We've been sitting on top of this thing for a while. And like, hey, welcome aboard, guys. We've been here for a while. Grab yourselves a drink. Come join us by the fire.
No, absolutely, and that's exactly what it's about. And at some point, of course, more and more we know the mainstream media, for want of a better word, now is becoming redundant, and I think Trump's going to really push that button very hard, and that's hugely important because people. But equally, the alternative media has its deficiencies, and we need to get the balance right in all manner, and eventually have all the media that works, in unison with each other, but gives the facts. And if we have an opinion, I mean, we all have opinions. I've just given my opinion about Bitcoin. Does it make my opinion set in stone or correct? Well, not necessarily. Absolutely not. And
Exactly.
in the fullness of time, will prove that. But where we state facts, we could be factually accurate in what we're saying, and that's the big difference. And I think that we will see that change in. Well, the mainstream media has a choice; it either does it or it dies. I mean, it's as
Yeah.
simple as that. And at the moment, it's dying very quickly.
Yeah. Mainstream media as well as mainstream banking. Everything's getting decentralized.
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is a big headache. I mean, people don't realize, they look, and Deutsche Bank made all the headlines recently, and I remember talking to someone. No, Deutsche Bank is not going to go down at this point. But what people don't realize is the reality is that the entire Western banking system is bust.
Yep.
It's insolvent, and that might terrify people and frighten people, but that's the stark reality. I mean, it's as plain as the nose on anyone's face what's been going on, and there is so much money that's being diverted to prop up the banks, and is ongoing. I mean, I spoke kind of before Christmas and around that time, where I became aware that most of the Western major banks are literally getting bailed out on a daily basis just to keep them afloat.
Yeah.
So there's all that. So it's like, there's this majestic swan on the water that's gliding along. Meanwhile, it all looks superficially fine. Underneath, the legs are going furiously just to stop the whole thing sinking. And that's still ongoing, and it has been. 2008 was just the start of the problems. It wasn't, oh, here's a problem, we've dealt with it. And we all know this, that the problem is just exacerbated and got worse and worse, which is why 2008 was a cakewalk compared to what economic collapse would happen in 2017 or whenever it's going to happen. And that's something that has been the greatest delusion of all, is the idea. What was one of the last things I think Obama said? Oh, we really strengthened the US economy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the problem is most people actually, who aren't aware of things, actually believe that's true. Meanwhile, we have nearly 100 million people economically inactive in the US. We have 50 million people on food stamps. Well, they rigged the food stamps to get them off that. But then they kind of called them, I can't remember the exact phrase, but essentially food hungry was we'll put them in the food hungry category. We won't allow them to have food stamps anymore. And somewhere I put a post up on the website, which is kind of, here's some of the reasons why the US economy is in, just get some graphs off Fred and you can just see, the economy is in decline. Of course, people aren't aware of this, and it's the same in the UK. The UK economy's floundering. I mean, the retail sales collapsed. Well, the housing market's starting to fall apart, and they've been two of the kind of benchmarks of the Western economies. Oh, well, the housing market's very strong, or that we've got a great economy, or retail sales are going through the roof. Well, the wheels are falling off in that regard. So we're seeing, in the UK, big problems, and no one reports it, and that's why what we're all doing. And there's many of us across the Western world and beyond trying to just shine some light on reality. It's important. So, it's not such a big shock when things do happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that right there, folks, is the end of our broadcast. London, Paul, thank you so much for joining us yet again on another edition of the Sirius Report. Folks, again, go check out the SiriusReport.com. That's Sirius Report spelled SIRIUS, the SiriusReport.com. And again, subscribe to Paul's podcast. You get those intel briefings on a daily basis from Paul, and you guys will have a great idea and an understanding of what's going on globally. And also, again, you can follow Paul. You have your Twitter at Sirius Report?
At the Sirius Report, yeah. It's a little bit underutilized, but going forward, we'll start to put quite a few more quotes out on a daily basis, just some ideas or things that are of interest. I mean, obviously, we have to protect our podcast users and don't give away too much, but we do give some free material because we want to encourage people to see, the kind of things we're going to deal with and why it might be of, some interest for them to obviously check out the premium content page and join us.
Absolutely. And you can always follow us, guys, at Rogue Money, at the Rogue Money on Twitter, roguemoney.net, Rogue Money Facebook. Check us out on Apple News. If you just go to the Apple News tab, just type in Rogue Money, and boom, we are there. We're soon going to be Google News certified. And also the podcasting app that's both on the iTunes as well as Android. So with that being said, we are over and out. Take it away, CJ.